I let the Homeowner Association threaten me because sometimes the fastest way to learn what kind of man you're dealing with is to give him enough rope to show the whole neighborhood what he'll do with it. The day was bright and dry, the kind of clean daylight that makes everything look sharper than it is. Paint lines, curb edges, even the smug confidence on a man's face when he thinks rules belong to him. And I rolled into my driveway with my motorcycle humming down to silence, dust clinging to the tire treads, leather jacket warm across my shoulders, black gloves still on, dark denim tight at the knees, heavy boots scuffing the concrete as I swung off the bike. Silver chain necklace catching a clean flash of sun. My house wasn't the biggest on the street, but it was solid, the kind of place you buy when you want peace and a steady routine, and I'd chosen this neighborhood for the quiet, for the order, for the simple pleasure of keeping your property clean and minding your own business. That was the plan anyway, until the Homeowner Association decided my own business belonged on their clipboard. I wasn't doing anything wild, no loud parties, no neon paint, no half-built projects left rotting for months. I was renovating in a way any responsible man would, replacing warped fence panels, rebuilding the front landing so it wouldn't flex under weight, and fixing the drainage angle that had been pushing water toward my foundation every time the sprinklers ran. Everything was daytime work, tidy, measured, and safe, the kind of improvements that make a home better and a street quieter. I had materials stacked neatly along the side yard, tools organized, and a folder on the workbench that held what mattered: plans, receipts, inspection checklists, and the permits I'd already started pulling because I didn't gamble with code compliance. The Homeowner Association didn't care. They never care when control is the point. The first notice showed up like a friendly reminder, a crisp sheet of paper with cheerful language that somehow still sounded like a threat, telling me exterior changes required association approval. I read it once, set it aside, and kept working because the exterior change was me preventing rotted boards from turning into a lawsuit if someone got hurt. The second notice came louder, bolded, stamped with warnings about fines and hearings demanding I stop work until the board reviewed my project. I ignored that too, not out of stubbornness but out of principle. My house wasn't a committee's hobby. That's when the HOA president showed up in person, stepping onto the edge of my driveway like he was claiming territory, flanked by two male board members who carried clipboards and phones held high, recording me from angles meant to make normal repairs look suspicious. The president's voice carried across the street on purpose, as if volume could create authority, announcing I was out of compliance, that my materials were unsightly, and that the board had the right to shut down my renovation immediately. He spoke like he'd practiced that speech in the mirror, like he'd delivered it to other men and watched them shrink. I didn't shrink. I didn't argue either. I just stood there in the sun with my gloves on, shoulders relaxed, letting him talk, because the more he talked, the more he revealed what mattered. He wasn't citing real code, he was citing his own confidence. He pointed at my stacked lumber and the half-finished landing and declared it was unauthorized construction, then demanded I hand him my permits for verification, as if he was some kind of official. I told him calmly that permits are between the property owner and the city, and that if he wanted to verify anything, he could file a request like anyone else. That answer landed wrong for him. He stepped closer, talking faster, shifting from rules to consequences, explaining how fines would accumulate daily, how liens could be placed, how the association could take action if I continued. The two board members nodded like he was preaching truth. One of them angled his phone closer to my face, trying to provoke a reaction. I kept my hands visible, stayed where I was on my property, and asked a simple question: what authority do you have to override city permits? The HOA president didn't answer directly. He circled it with words about community standards and property values, then repeated the threat of fines like it was an answer. That was when I decided quietly that I wasn't going to cut him off. I wasn't going to end the conversation early. I wanted him on record. I wanted the neighborhood to hear exactly what kind of enforcement he thought he could do, so I let him continue. He announced a hearing date I hadn't agreed to, told me contractors would be reported, and said my vehicle, my motorcycle, parked cleanly and legally in my own driveway, was not appropriate for the community image, which told me the real issue wasn't my landing or my fence, it was the fact that I didn't fit his little picture of obedience. Across the street, my neighbor Mike stepped out, a middle-aged guy with a steady stare, arms folded, watching the show with the expression of a man who'd seen the HOA bully others and wondered when someone would finally stand still long enough to expose it. Another neighbor, Phil, paused with a trash bin halfway down his drive, listening. More men hovered at their windows, pretending they were. The president noticed the attention and fed off it, speaking even louder, promising that if I didn't stop today, I'd regret it tomorrow. I gave him nothing but calm. "You're welcome to file whatever you think you need to file," I said, "but you don't get to order me on my property." He snapped back that he could have me cited, that he knew people at the city, that he could make this hard, and that line, "make this hard," was the moment I felt the story click into place, because it wasn't about compliance, it was about punishment. When the HOA president finally turned to leave, he jabbed a finger toward my front landing as if the wood itself had insulted him, and he promised that by the end of the week I'd be facing fines big enough to force change. Then he motioned to his two board members like they were security and marched away. Mike exhaled slow and heavy and walked over once the HOA group was out of earshot. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said, peeling one glove off and flexing my fingers. "They always act like that," Mike gave a bitter half-smile. "They act like nobody can stop them." Phil called from his driveway. "They tried it on me last year over a shed, and the way he said tried told me he'd backed down." I nodded, not judging, just listening, because the HOA counts on men being isolated. That's how they win. I picked up the last notice the president had slapped onto my workbench and read it again, watching how it used official-sounding phrases with no citations, no real legal references, just threats dressed up as policy. Then my phone buzzed with a message from my contractor, a guy named Joe. "Got a call from HOA. They said if I work there, I'll get blacklisted from the neighborhood." I stared at the screen for a moment in the bright sun, then typed back, "Work continues. Document everything." I set the phone down, put my glove back on, and went right back to measuring the landing stringers, because I wasn't going to let an association freeze legitimate repairs with intimidation. But inside, I made another decision too, one I didn't say out loud to Mike or Phil, because it wasn't time yet. I was going to let the HOA president keep threatening me until he crossed the exact line that made consequences unavoidable. The best part about daylight is that it doesn't just expose lumber and nails, it exposes motives. And as I drove the first screw into fresh wood, the sound clean and sharp, I could already see the path forming ahead. More threats, bigger claims, louder pressure, and eventually a moment where the HOA would try to flex on the wrong person in the wrong way. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I wasn't avoiding one either, because when a man believes he can bully a neighborhood into obedience, the only thing that stops him is a boundary he can't argue with, and I was already preparing to draw it. The escalation came exactly the way I expected it would, not in a single dramatic move but in layers, each one designed to tighten pressure without ever admitting what they were really doing. Because the Homeowner Association didn't want me to stop renovating, they wanted me to submit. By the next morning, under the same clear daylight that had framed the president's little performance, my driveway was lined with orange cones that hadn't been there the night before, placed just far enough in to suggest authority but not far enough to be outright trespass. And zip-tied to my fence was a laminated notice declaring "Work halted pending HOA review," printed in bold letters meant to scare contractors more than homeowners. I stood there with my coffee still warm in my hand, leather jacket on, boots planted on my own concrete, and I didn't tear it down right away, because sometimes it's useful to see how far someone is willing to go when they think no one is watching. Neighbors slowed as they passed, eyes flicking to the cones, then to me, then away again, and I could almost hear the question hanging in the air. Did they really have the power to do that? I cut the zip tie, folded the notice carefully, and set it on my workbench next to the others, a neat stack of threats that all said the same thing in different fonts. By mid-morning, the HOA president returned with reinforcements. 3 board members this time, all men, all talking at once, their voices overlapping as if volume could substitute for clarity, and he announced loudly that fines were now officially accruing, throwing out numbers that climbed higher with every sentence. I asked him calmly to show me the vote record authorizing those fines and the section of any recorded document that allowed the association to halt permitted repairs, and he responded by accusing me of arguing semantics, which is always what people say when they don't like the difference between opinion and law. One of the board members started filming again, circling to get angles of my materials and my bike, lingering on anything he thought could look bad out of context, and I let him because the truth doesn't flinch on camera. The president then shifted tactics, announcing that the association had contacted the city to report unsafe construction. And when I nodded and told him I welcomed inspection, he looked momentarily thrown, like he'd expected fear instead of agreement. He recovered quickly, declaring that even if the city didn't stop the work immediately, the association would take further action, a phrase that drew murmurs from the men behind him because even they knew it sounded like a threat without a plan. The pressure didn't stop with words. Before noon, my contractor called to say he'd received a call warning him that continuing to work on my property could jeopardize future jobs in the neighborhood. A soft blacklist delivered with polite language, and I could hear the frustration in his voice, not fear, but annoyance at being dragged into someone else's power play. I told him what I'd already decided. The work would continue, everything would be documented, and any attempt to interfere would be added to the record. He agreed, and that agreement mattered more than he probably realized, because intimidation only works when people isolate you. By early afternoon, a city vehicle rolled slowly down the street, responding to one of the association's complaints, and the HOA president appeared almost instantly, as if summoned by the sound of an engine, positioning himself to intercept, already talking before the inspector had both feet on the ground. I stayed where I was, hands visible, letting the inspector approach me first, Because authority recognizes authority, and the inspector asked for permits, plans, and a walkthrough, which I provided without hesitation. The HOA president hovered, interjecting comments about community impact and visual standards, trying to steer the conversation away from safety and legality and back into his comfort zone. But the inspector didn't bite, focusing instead on measurements, supports, drainage slope, and materials, the things that actually matter. When the inspector finished, he said there were no issues at that time and that the scheduled inspection would proceed as planned, and the look on the HOA president's face wasn't anger, it was irritation. The irritation of a man whose bluff had just been called in public. He recovered by announcing that the association would appeal the city's inaction, a statement that made no sense and didn't need to because it was meant for the neighbors, not the inspector. The inspector left and the HOA group stayed, lingering, talking among themselves, clearly trying to decide their next move, and I could feel the escalation shifting from overt threats to something more calculated. That shift showed itself that evening when an all-neighborhood email went out, framing my renovation as an ongoing dispute and urging residents to remain vigilant about unauthorized activity, language vague enough to avoid outright lies but specific enough to paint me as a problem. Mike forwarded it to me with a single line, "They're trying to turn people." He wasn't wrong. The next day, the pressure came from the sides instead of the front. A supplier called to verify my order. A neighbor asked awkwardly whether I was allowed to be doing what I was doing. Another neighbor mentioned quietly that the HOA president had stopped by to check in and ask whether they'd noticed any issues with my work. None of it was aggressive on its own, but together it formed a net, the kind designed to make a man feel watched from all angles. The HOA president returned again that afternoon, this time alone, tone softer, almost friendly, suggesting that if I paused the work voluntarily and submitted revised plans to the board, they could resolve this without further conflict. And I recognized the move immediately. Intimidation had failed, so now came the offer that made compliance sound reasonable. I told him I wasn't pausing permitted work, and that if the association had concerns, they could put them in writing and route them through the city like everyone else. His friendliness evaporated, replaced by a warning that I was forcing the association's hand, and he left with the promise that the next step would be formal. That formality arrived faster than expected. Before the end of the day, I received notice of an emergency HOA hearing scheduled without regard to my availability, complete with a list of alleged violations that recycled the same vague claims over and over. And reading it under the bright afternoon sun, I felt the escalation settle into something heavier, because hearings and fines are how associations try to manufacture legitimacy when they don't have it. I didn't attend. Attending would have implied their authority was real. Instead, I spent the remaining daylight doing something far more effective. I organized everything, every notice, every email, every complaint number, every inspection result, every recorded interaction. I lined them up by date and time until a pattern emerged so clear it didn't need commentary, and as I worked, the realization sharpened that the HOA's biggest mistake wasn't threatening me, it was doing it repeatedly, publicly, and on record. By the time the sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows across my driveway, the pressure was still there, but it had changed shape, no longer a wall in front of me but a pile of evidence behind them, and I understood that the escalation phase was nearly complete, because when bullies stop trying to scare you and start trying to overwhelm you, it means they're running out of moves. 3 Part 3 Crisis, 1100 words, one single uninterrupted paragraph, daytime mail only. The crisis hit the moment the Homeowner Association stopped pretending this was about rules and showed it was about punishment, because the day after their so-called emergency hearing, the pressure didn't just increase, it turned systemic, designed to box me in from every side at once. Under sharp, unforgiving daylight, a certified envelope arrived at my door before noon, thick and heavy in a way that told the story before I even opened it, containing a formally filed lawsuit naming me as the problem, accusing me of harassment, property damage, noncompliance, and willful disregard for association authority, with a damages figure inflated high enough to make headlines but vague enough to survive on intimidation alone. I stood in my driveway with the papers in my hands, leather jacket creaking slightly as I shifted my weight, motorcycle resting nearby, and I didn't feel panic so much as clarity, because this was the move they'd been building toward all along, the moment where they tried to convert noise into leverage. The lawsuit wasn't meant to win in court, it was meant to win in real life by draining time, money, and resolve. And the HOA president wasted no time spreading word of it, talking loudly across the street about how I was being sued, and how this was serious now, letting the implication do the work without explaining why. The crisis deepened when my contractor called again, this time more tense, explaining that his insurance carrier had received inquiries referencing ongoing litigation and unsafe work, proof that the association was now reaching beyond me, trying to choke the project by threatening everyone connected to it. I told him the same thing I told myself. The permits were valid, the inspections were clean, and intimidation doesn't turn lies into truth, But I could hear the strain anyway because lawsuits have a way of making even innocent people cautious. As if coordinated, the city inspection schedule suddenly filled with surprise visits. Inspectors responding to complaints filed back-to-back alleging different violations within hours of each other. And by mid-afternoon, there were more city vehicles on the street than neighbors outside, each inspector confused about why they were there again so soon. I walked them through the site one by one, repeating the same explanations, showing the same documents, answering the same questions, and each time the result was identical. No violations found. But repetition itself became the weapon, because defending the truth repeatedly is exhausting by design. Across the street, the HOA president lingered like a shadow, narrating events loudly to anyone who would listen, claiming the city was slow, and that the association would protect the neighborhood if the government wouldn't. A statement reckless enough to border on delusion, but delivered with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged. Neighbors watched in silence, some clearly uncomfortable, others starting to understand that this wasn't enforcement. It was a personal crusade, and standing there under the bright sky, I felt the isolation sharpen, not because I doubted my position, but because the HOA was trying to turn a legal process into social pressure. The lawsuit paperwork sat on my workbench all afternoon, a physical reminder of what they hoped would break me. And for the first time since this started, the thought crossed my mind that stopping the renovation would make all of this disappear quickly, that compliance would buy peace, and recognizing that thought scared me more than the threats themselves, because it meant the pressure was doing exactly what it was designed to do. The crisis peaked when another notice arrived before sunset, this one announcing daily fines now officially assessed, and warning that liens were under consideration. Language meant to sound final even though it rested on authority they didn't actually have. I sat on the edge of the rebuilt landing, sunlight still strong, tools quiet for the moment, and let the weight of it all settle, not to wallow in it, but to understand it fully, because reacting emotionally was exactly what the HOA wanted. The real danger wasn't the lawsuit or the inspections, it was the attempt to force a rushed decision under stress, to make me choose exhaustion over principle. That's when I understood the crisis for what it really was. Not a test of compliance, but a test of whether I would keep playing defense on their terms or finally change the frame of the fight entirely. The HOA had built their entire strategy around the assumption that I was just another homeowner they could pressure quietly into submission, and every escalation they made was based on that false premise. Standing there in the daylight, bike close enough to touch, leather jacket warm against my back, I realized the only way out of the crisis wasn't to answer the lawsuit faster or explain the permits louder. It was to stop treating the HOA like the authority in the room and start treating their behavior itself as the violation. The moment that shift clicked into place, the pressure changed shape immediately because instead of feeling surrounded, I felt focused. And focus is dangerous when it's backed by documentation. I gathered every complaint number, every inspection closure, every recorded threat, every notice, and laid them out in order until the pattern was undeniable even without commentary. Repeated interference, misuse of complaint systems, intimidation of contractors, and public misrepresentation of authority. By the time the sun dipped just enough to stretch long shadows across the driveway, the crisis hadn't gone away, but it had reached its breaking point. Because once you see the real problem clearly, you stop trying to survive it and start preparing to expose it. The HOA didn't know it yet, but by pushing as hard as they did, they had finally crossed the line that made consequences inevitable. And the next move wouldn't be another argument or another defense. It would be a turning point that placed their conduct under scrutiny they couldn't talk their way out of. The turning point came not with a confrontation but with a decision, the kind that feels quiet on the outside and final on the inside. Because once I stopped reacting to the Homeowner Association and started documenting them as a subject of review, the entire balance of power shifted. Under clear daylight, I spread everything out on the workbench in my garage, not like a homeowner defending himself, but like an investigator building a case. Every notice they'd posted, every fine they claimed to assess, every email they'd sent to neighbors, every complaint number tied to city inspections that found nothing wrong, every recorded interaction where they spoke with confidence about authority they didn't actually have. I wasn't emotional about it anymore because emotion clouds patterns, and what mattered now was showing that this wasn't a disagreement, it was a campaign. I submitted a formal complaint to the city that afternoon, not about my renovation, but about sustained interference with permitted work, citing the repeated misuse of municipal complaint systems and the unauthorized attempts by a private association to halt lawful construction. The response came faster than anything else so far, an acknowledgement followed by a scheduled compliance review, and the tone alone told me the file had landed on a desk that understood what it was looking at. When the city vehicles arrived 2 days later, they came together, inspectors and supervisors stepping out under the same bright sun that had exposed every bluff so far. And the questions they asked weren't about my beams or drainage. They were about the association's conduct, who had ordered the cones placed, who had contacted contractors, who had filed identical complaints across multiple departments. I handed over the organized timeline, and I watched the shift happen in real time as the officials flipped through page after page showing the same names. The same language, the same lack of jurisdiction, all stacked neatly in sequence. The Homeowner Association representatives arrived late, trying to assert presence with confident posture and practiced explanations about community standards. But this time their words didn't steer the room, because the questions they faced were precise, asking them to cite exact legal authority, to explain why they believed HOA rules could override city permits, and to justify instructing residents and vendors to stop work without any enforcement power. There was no shouting, no dramatic showdown, just the slow unraveling of a story that couldn't survive scrutiny. As the officials walked the site and confirmed once again that the renovation was permitted, inspected, and compliant, the conversation narrowed until only one issue remained: interference. One of the supervisors stated it plainly, explaining that while associations can set guidelines, they cannot obstruct permitted work or harass a homeowner through repeated baseless complaints, and that continuing to do so could result in enforcement action against the association itself. That sentence landed heavier than all the HOA's threats combined, because it wasn't a warning delivered in anger, it was a consequence delivered in calm. Before leaving, the city issued a written directive ordering the association to immediately cease all interference, remove any barriers or notices they had placed, and route any future concerns through proper legal channels instead of direct action. And reading it under the open sky felt like watching a door finally close on weeks of manufactured chaos. The HOA president tried to recover, suggesting meetings, pauses, compromises that would have required me to stop working, but the officials shut those down quickly, making it clear that permitted work was not subject to negotiation by an organization without jurisdiction. Within hours, the neighborhood changed tone completely. Cones disappeared, notices were quietly removed, the constant filming stopped, and the stream of complaints dried up so abruptly it was obvious they'd never been organic. The lawsuit they'd filed began to lose its teeth almost immediately, because without the narrative of violations to prop it up, it became a stack of accusations unsupported by facts, and their communications shifted from aggressive to cautious, deadlines softened, language rewritten, as if they suddenly remembered that every word could be read by someone who didn't care about their position. Neighbors noticed the change too, stopping by more openly, some admitting they'd been warned not to get involved, others saying they'd never seen the association challenged this directly before. And standing there on my driveway with the work progressing again, I felt the pressure that had been building for weeks finally release, not as triumph, but as balance restored. The turning point wasn't that I'd outargued anyone. It was that the argument had been removed from the HOA's invented arena and placed where it belonged, under city oversight that dealt in permits and conduct, not intimidation. As the daylight softened and shadows stretched across the finished section of the landing, I understood that the hardest part was over, because once interference is named, documented, and addressed by real authority, it stops being a tactic and starts being a liability. And from that moment forward, every move the Homeowner Association made would only tighten consequences they could no longer avoid. The resolution didn't explode into existence the way the Homeowner Association always imagined power did. It settled in quietly, officially, and with finality, because once real authority stepped in, there was nothing left for them to posture against. The city's written directive went out first, clear and unmistakable, stating that my renovation was fully permitted, code-compliant, and protected from obstruction, and that any further interference by the association would be treated as a violation subject to enforcement, and the effect of that single document rippled through the neighborhood faster than any threat ever had. The cones vanished overnight, the warning notices were peeled down without ceremony, and the HOA president who once treated my driveway like his personal stage stopped showing up entirely, replaced by silence so sudden it felt almost artificial. Their lawsuit, filed with so much noise and confidence during the height of the crisis, began to collapse under its own weight once the city's findings were entered into the record, because without violations to point to, it was nothing but accusation stacked on accusation. And within weeks it was quietly withdrawn, dismissed without apology or explanation, the legal equivalent of backing out of a room without making eye contact. Neighbors noticed the shift immediately. Men who had kept their heads down during the conflict now stopping by in daylight, admitting in low voices that they'd been pressured before, warned not to question fines, threatened with hearings over trivial things, and that watching someone refuse to bend had forced the association to finally overreach in a way that couldn't be ignored. The renovation finished cleanly and on schedule, the landing solid, the fence straight, the drainage corrected so water flowed where it should, and each completed detail felt less like a victory and more like the restoration of something that should never have been disrupted in the first place. But the real resolution wasn't in the wood or concrete, it was in the sudden reordering of behavior around me, because the Homeowner Association didn't just lose this fight, they lost the illusion that intimidation was invisible. Board members stepped down for personal reasons, enforcement committees were quietly restructured, and new guidelines circulated acknowledging, for the first time in plain language, that city permits supersede association preferences, a sentence that would have sounded obvious before all this started but now carried weight. One afternoon, as the daylight stretched long shadows across the street, the HOA president finally approached me again, not with a crowd, not with a clipboard, but alone, posture stiff, voice controlled, and told me the association would be moving forward differently, which was as close to an admission as a man like that would ever give. I listened, nodded once, and told him I expected no further interference, and when he agreed and walked away without another word, the chapter closed itself. What he never realized, and what the association never suspected, was that they hadn't just threatened another homeowner who knew the rules, they had threatened the man now responsible for enforcing them beyond their cul-de-sac. When the city had stepped in, it wasn't just because of permits or paperwork. It was because the pattern of abuse had landed on the desk of someone who understood exactly how misuse of authority looks from both sides. Someone who had recently taken on a role where intimidation, false enforcement, and harassment weren't abstract concepts but daily responsibilities to address. I hadn't announced it, hadn't worn a badge or made a speech, because authority doesn't need an introduction to function, and letting the Homeowner Association believe they were bullying an ordinary homeowner had given them enough rope to document everything they did wrong. By the time they realized the city wasn't just siding with me but scrutinizing them, it was already too late to backtrack because the record was complete, the conduct clear, and the consequences unavoidable. Standing in my driveway one final afternoon with the work finished, motorcycle resting nearby, leather jacket catching the sun, I looked at the house not as a battleground but as what it had always been meant to be, a place governed by law, not by loud men with clipboards. And the simplicity of that truth made the entire ordeal feel smaller in hindsight. The Homeowner Association thought they could threaten me into submission because they believed power was something you claimed loudly and defended aggressively. But real power doesn't shout, it documents, it waits, and it acts when the line is crossed. Letting them threaten me wasn't weakness, it was patience, because every notice they posted, every fine they invented, every call they made added another piece to a record they couldn't erase. In the end, the city didn't just shut them down on my renovation. It put them on notice for good, and the neighborhood felt it immediately, quieter, fairer, less tense, as if everyone could breathe again. As the sun dipped low and the street settled back into its normal rhythm, the lesson locked itself into place with the kind of clarity that doesn't fade. Authority isn't proven by how loudly you threaten, it's proven by what happens when the right system finally steps in, and the Homeowner Association learned the hard way that they had threatened the wrong man in the wrong town. Because sometimes the person who lets you talk the longest is the one holding the badge when the talking stops.